Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the EuroSTAR webinar this afternoon from Bob Galen, entitled Agile Testing, Facing the Challenges in Test Management, Common Anti-Patterns. Before I hand you guys over to Bob, I just want to point out a couple of things to you. The most important being the Questions and Answers tab, which is the fourth tab across on the top of your screen. So if you guys would like to ask a question at any time during the webinar, just click on this tab, and where it says Ask the Presenter a Question, just type your question in here and hit Ask. All questions will then be answered at the end of the webinar. We'll also be recording this webinar, so a live or on-demand version of this webinar will be available in the coming weeks on the EuroSTAR website, and you guys will all get an email to let you know when that is ready. So without further ado, I'd like to hand you over to Bob. Good afternoon, Bob.
Good afternoon, Kevin. I want to thank you for having me this morning or this afternoon, and I want to thank EuroSTAR for having me as well, and thanks everyone for dialing in. We have a little bit of, quite a bit of material to go over, so I think we'll just dive in. From an introduction perspective, Agile testing, I think, is really, really hard. But on the surface, it appears simple, and I think it can be misleading to folks who are trying to adopt Agile as to what the transitional dynamics are and what the challenges are. I think the core of Agile testing is part of the problem because it hits very easy contexts and it doesn't really address what I think are more complex testing contexts, which most of us are really living in the day-to-day world or in the real world. If I go to the next, what do I mean by easy context? To give you a feeling for that, that Agile is sort of the sweet spot for. Some of them are low culture project management discipline where you don't have a PMO, you don't necessarily have project plans or tooling, ongoing projects that have already been. So you're in the middle of a project and you sort of plop Agile on top of it. Small projects with very little investment, very little executive interest. They may be important, but they're relatively small and they're not critical to the business dynamic. So that's a context that's sort of a sweet spot for Agile testing. There's not a lot of contention there. Some other areas are very small. One of the tenets of agility, and you all probably know this, is it's very small co-located teams. Well, what happens if you get out of that context? What if the corollary to that is what if you get into a very large distributed team? What if you have facilities around the world? Well, how does Agile map to that? That's a real challenge to real teams, both from an Agile methods point of view and from a testing point of view, where the teams are well-formed, comfortable, and highly skilled. So I've seen Agile, if you have a well-formed team that's well-behaved, that really works well together, then placing Agile on top of that, introducing it that team works really well. But what if the team isn't well-formed? What if they've never worked together before? What if they're distributed, again, around the world, even if it's in a non-large company, if it's just a small company, but you have distributed resources. So sort of the open source community would be an example of that. Startup entrepreneurial companies, Agile is a buzzword, so there's a lot of buzz around that from an entrepreneurial or startup perspective. All of those are what I think of as some of the easier contexts where Agile testing is easier. It sort of falls out. The premises, the core tenets of Agile testing work better there. There's some, though, that there's a lot of context where it doesn't. If I was interactive with you all, and I wish I was could interact with you face to face. One of my questions is, what are a few of the tougher contexts? And I've explored some of them. I think that let's try to make a list of them just to give a sense for that. So large companies, large IT departments, distributed systems development, hardware development is a context where Agile, anything that's doing software on top of hardware, would be a context that I think would be very challenging. Regulatory context where you need more documentation, where you need traceability, where you have regulatory concerns and staging gates and sign-offs and things like that. An organization that has an instantiated project management office and relatively rigorous project management discipline would be a place where I think you would stretch, Agile would become more difficult. Environments where you don't have a lot of test automation, I think would be another tougher context. There's an assumption in Agile teams that we're doing a lot of automation along the way, and that's wonderful for greenfield efforts where you can continue to invest in automation along the way. But what if you have a legacy, a 10 million lines of code or 20 million lines of code legacy system that has very little automation wrapped around it, and then you wrap Agile around that? That becomes a real challenge for that team to quote unquote be Agile and to adopt it quickly, because you really don't have that automation infrastructure supporting you. So that's another area. I think I've covered some of the major points where it's tough out there in context. Managing then these patterns or anti-patterns. For this webinar, I wanted to just isolate on some test management anti-patterns, and then talk about appropriate patterns for these tougher contexts. So the four that we're going to review, and it's not exhaustive. These are just they're sort of interesting to me, and I hope they're interesting to you. So not accommodating traditional testing phases is an anti-pattern we'll explore. We can't adjust our plans or approaches, so we can't adjust those. Our thinking plans have to stay the same. Testers and developers don't need to work together, and fundamentally that belief permeates an organization. And then finally, we have to supply the same metrics as we always have. So we're going to go through these four anti-patterns. We'll explore them. In the back of your mind, I want you to constantly be thinking of tougher contexts. So these things really don't become much of an issue if you're a 4-person development firm in your garage doing a website or doing an entrepreneurial startup sort of software as a service product, and you're all, your whiteboard is where you do all your plans, and everyone drinks coffee together and sits together. A lot of this stuff doesn't apply in those easier contexts, but if you like me have a lot of experience in the tougher context, then I think some of these things will apply and will be helpful. So the first anti-pattern is not accommodating traditional test phases. I think one of the things that the Agile community has done is it's sort of trivialized testing towards unit, functional, and acceptance tests. And I know I'm taking liberties here, and I'm not really slamming the Agilist. I'm a strong Agilist, but I think one of the things we've done, and it came out of the extreme programming community, is we focus towards testing in the iteration or testing in the sprint so much more than we focused on other forms of testing that traditional testers realize have great value. So we're only performing, Agile only really focuses on sort of a subset of testing activities within the sprint, and we're not, we focus on user story-based testing, and that's what I mean by deliverables within the sprint. And we'll focus on story testing. We might do some partial regression. We do some unit testing. Certainly, we'll do acceptance testing around that, but full regression or integration testing or performance testing, those are non-functional testing, system test level testing, third-party testing. Those things that are relevant for larger contexts really don't fit very well into the discussions of Agile testing, or not nearly as much as they should. So that's the anti-pattern here, is we're really, we dive into Agile and we want to be Agile, and we sort of throw out some of our traditional techniques or our approaches or our testing phases. And I think we overdo that. And the other thing we don't do is we're not accommodating technical test debt in your product backlog. We're really not managing that. And what I mean by technical test debt, that could be automation that's not written. That could be test plans that aren't done. That could be test cases that aren't kept up to date. That could be tests that have not been run and should be run. For example, on an iteration or a sprint-by-sprint basis, we haven't fully run our regression tests. We've only done partial regression from a risk-based perspective, which is perfectly fine and healthy. But every iteration where we do that and we're not fully testing, we're building up coverage, what I think of as coverage technical test debt, in that we have risk out there that we haven't exposed. So these are some of that's describing that anti-pattern. So I think the harsh reality of what I'm alluding to is you don't want to throw your traditional testing activities out the window. They're really needed. Risk-based regression testing at the end of iterations will often incur test it. So the implication there is please do risk-based testing. Please, in the traditional test sense where you analyze risk, you analyze, you vet that with external forces, you vet that with the business, and you really force your team and encourage your team to understand what trade-offs they're making from a test coverage perspective. And you actually collaborate with your product owner to do the same thing. Personally, I think code freezes, and I know I may take abuse for some of these points in this webinar, but I personally think that code freezes are relative in sprints and in release sequences of Agile projects. At some point, you have to stop the madness, and you have to transition from coding, violent coding, to perhaps violently narrowing down your set of features, your set of user stories for release. That notion of narrowing things down, what I think of as endgame management, where you're transitioning from full coding to bug fixing to only high priority bug fixing to stabilizing a release, I think that cone of funneling things down still applies as well. And then your bug fixing intervals. So some of this stuff, the code freeze and the narrowing and the bug fix, are what I think of as end game activities. You don't want to throw them out. Now your end games are iterative and the dynamics are going to be different, but don't forget that you have an end game in your sprint. That end game is usually the last few days of the sprint. There may be a test focus. Even though we're trying to test every day along the sprint, the dynamic is test every user story and thoroughly test it and do that collaboratively. There's still going to be this skew potentially in the harder context of the harder environments. The other thing that I want to encourage you to at least think about, I'm not forcing it on you, and this is not a best practice. I don't think there are any best practices, but this is a reasonable practice to consider, is the notion of a hardening sprint, particularly not so much in sprint dynamics, but in release dynamics when you're doing release planning, meaning you're doing multiple sprints to develop a product, but at some point you might have 8 or 9 sprints that were joined together, and you want to then do a release after that. Well, now you're switching from developing content to readying the product for customer delivery. And it could be in a monthly release interval, it could be a quarterly release interval. But when you're getting ready for these real release points, I think of sprints as having artificial release points. We're trying to get done software. We're trying to test it thoroughly and to do as much testing as possible. But rarely, in my experience, in the tougher context, can you do all of the testing that you would do prior to a full production release. One example of that would be performance testing. Rarely can you do performance testing on a sprint-by-sprint basis, or rarely can you do full regression testing, particularly if you don't have a lot of automation, on a sprint-by-sprint basis. So you defer some of this debt, and how do you pay that debt back? Well, one notion is a different type of sprint called a hardening or a stabilization sprint. And I think leveraging them can be a healthy part of the dynamic, and not feeling like you're being unagile by doing it, as long as it's appropriate, and as long as you're trying to make it as lean as possible. So hardening or stabilization sprints become inviting opportunities to reduce debt, and you need to plan them. So you need to sort of anticipate them and sell them and not be embarrassed to use them. Even Agile projects need to close down testing in many cases. So they have, you will have a regression and a system testing phase, no matter what you call it, and integration with third-party services, etc. The other thing that will drive this is environment costs. My current company is a software as a service provider, and we have not emulated our production environment because of cost reasons and because of complexity reasons. So there are certain things that we just can't test, or we can't test in our development environments, in our early QA environments. We have to wait for staging and then pre-production and production to do some of that testing, and again, you're deferring that debt. So don't be embarrassed. Consider different types of sprints as part of your strategy. The second anti-pattern that I want to discuss is we can't adjust our plans or approaches. So this is this static view of we're going to do it the same old way. We're going to be agile, but we're going to plan agile. Or a variant of this starting at the bottom, is I've seen a lot of Agile teams, they'll go into Agile, and there's this notion, I'm from North Carolina, so there's this notion of whole hog, which is all in, which is, if you use poker terminology, you're all in. So if you become Agile, then you throw away all of your traditional practices. So you throw away all of your planning so that you don't do any planning at all. You sort of just jump into a sprint and you start reacting to user stories without thinking or any thoughtful view to how we're going to tell stories for the release and how we're going to do systematic testing along the way, and regression testing, and how we're going to do risk-based planning and things like that. You throw it all out. So the anti-pattern here is either doing no planning whatsoever or being stuck in your traditional views and not realizing that Agile is a disruptor from a planning perspective, and that you have to sort of go along with that flow and sort of adjust a lot of your techniques. And your context really matters. And skipping steps and trusting your team. What I mean by skipping steps is not detailing every step in a test case. For example, trusting that your team has domain knowledge, that you don't have to exhaustively define everything. So you start bringing in some Agile tenets like trust your team, trust your team's experience, trust their judgment in handling critical features differently from mundane features, so that they're almost doing on-the-fly thinking based on their experience for risk-based application. But the point there is adjusting, either not adjusting at all or adjusting too much, and we want to hit the middle ground. So I actually highly recommend, and this is a little contrary to a lot of Agile teams, but I get a lot of traction here in my home teams of recommending per sprint and per release test plans. And we construct a very small but very useful guide when we do our release planning for a release sequence of sprints. And before each sprint, we have these lightweight artifacts, and we spend a little time talking about test strategies for the user stories that are going to be executed in the sprint. We talk about testability. We talk about coverage. We'll talk about performance implications. We'll talk about exchange points between the developers and the testers. And I'm talking about micro handoffs. I'm not talking about macro handoffs. It really helps. What happens is it's not the plan document itself. We don't blindly follow it. But the real intention is the plan drives some wonderful conversations in the team, and they talk about it, and they talk about their strategies. And it's not just a tester's plan. It's really a team plan. So it's for the entire team to get everyone thinking about risk and testing and coverage very early on in the sprint, and we get a tremendous amount of traction out of that. And also in the release. So the release plans have a release flow, and the sprint plans have a sprint flow. But again, it's that conversation element that you want product owners talking with developers, talking with testers, talking with BAs, and really having that wonderful collaboration that you hear so much about in Agile. And it's nice if you can actually realize it. And this is an artifact that helps us get to that point. We still aren't at the point where the developers think of it as their plan as much as the testers do. So it's an evolutionary path, but it helps get close to that. And then test cases. You need to define manual test cases for new features. To what degree do you need to do that? So more of a context by context based analysis of some of your planning on a test by test basis. Another thing you want to think about with your Agile planning adjustments is sort of the prime directive. I think of one of the prime directives of testers in Agile teams is to test anything development teams have to offer. And I see some teams really struggle with this because, my favorite example of this is you could be in the middle of a planned testing sequence and, you plan 3 days to test a previous version of the product, a handoff in a sprint, and you get another version at the end of day one, so you've only completed 1/3 of your quote-unquote planned tests. So the question is, do you complete the 2/3 that you're missing that you plan to do, or do you just grab that new deliverable from development and start pounding on it and start testing it instead? And the answer is grab that new one. We always want to be, we don't want to be blindly following plans. We want to be thoughtful, so you might want to run a few test cases on that previous version, but the real impetus is to make that instantaneous transition to start looking at new stuff so that you can get the latest code, the latest feedback, and you can be in real time and in lockstep with your development colleagues. You don't want to fall behind. Much of Agile is about real-time feedback and real-time response and being very adaptive, and you want to get into that point. You want to work with the product owner immediately if they have changes. If you detect something in that testing, you want to, another part of this is you want to grab and test as soon as possible. If you find issues, you want to stop the line, meaning let's stop and fix it. So it's not, we can report it as a bug, but that's less crucial from my point of view than stopping the line and fixing that bug right away and exposing it to the product owner and the team. And then another thing you want to really think about, and this is more of at a macro level across in your sprint plans and in your release plans, is how are you handling the technical test debt? How are you managing test debt? Because inherently, you really, as an Agile test team, as an Agile tester, the mechanisms of Agile are creating test debt very dynamically. And you just need to expose that, and you need to have some strategies to handle that. So iterative testing, you want to do regression, and as much as you can, and be nimble in your regression tests. You want to have environment promotion strategies that have entry and exit criteria. And I know that sounds waterfall-esque, but you really do. You want to have clarity around, hey, what is a promotion candidate and how we do that? You want to have a final hardening or stabilization sprint if it's warranted. Don't be embarrassed to do that. You may have multiples. Again, I know that may sound like a waterfall test, a system test interval, and it sort of has some of that flavor, but it's really not. It's beating down that debt. The other thing that you really want to be conscious of is handling non-functional testing requirements and making that clear. Writing those user stories. So user stories are not, I think one of the misconceptions in Agile teams is user stories are just they're feature rich. They're not just featured. They're not just for features. They're for activities. They're for work. So I think good test teams as part of Agile planning adjustments, you're throwing stories in the backlog that are related to test activities. And so when I say plan release sequencing, how that's sort of instantiated in the team is by placing test work focused stories in the backlog, managing their priority, managing their placement, making it visible to the product owner, prioritizing it effectively, doing those value exchanges between features, the balancing act between features and quality proposition, if you will, or coverage proposition with the team. The third anti-pattern is testers and developers don't need to work together. So I think there's in a lot of these larger contexts, because it's hard to pull people together, because there's budget constraints or whatever, because it's traditional management thinking. Oh, we're being agile, but we're being agile only where it's comfortable for us. We're not really going to challenge ourselves to do it properly, or we're going to fool ourselves into thinking, give ourselves as many excuses as we can. One of the excuse areas that I think we need to push on, and it is an anti-pattern, is this notion that testers and developers don't need to work together. I violently disagree with that. I think if you're adopting Agile in any context, to the degree that you can, you have a responsibility to get developers and testers working together, to get them as close as possible. If they're not sitting in my current company, we sit together. We have pods where we have teams focused on product areas, and testers and developers and BAs and our product owners and our Scrum Masters sit together. Now we have distributed teams where some folks are outside of the team, but essentially when we're doing planning, we get that team together. We don't draw a distinction between functional test and functional development. And I think that's what I'm poking at here. Developers, so the anti-pattern is they don't sit together. It could be a separate floor is often the same as totally different locales. So don't confuse distance as, short distance can be a real issue. Developers on one continent and testers on another is a terrible part of this anti-pattern. The teams have never physically met. I can't tell you how many times in my coaching folks want to adopt Agile and they adopt pilots, but they just throw names on org charts distributed across the globe together, and they expect that Agile team. They've never met. They hardly know. They don't know what each other looks like. They barely know their email addresses. But oh, by the way, we're going to form a wonderfully cohesive and collaborative Agile team, and that doesn't work. It's very hard to work at. And then little training into how to interact, or in tooling or whatnot. So, we're not even putting forth a good effort to try to get cohesion going and to acknowledge that it's important. So I think there are some things to focus on. And I'm not suggesting that it's easy. I'm not suggesting that you have to have co-located teams, but I'm saying don't ignore the aspect of distributed teams. Try to get them as quote-unquote close, even if it's virtually close together. Try to get the teams as close as you can. So team structures. All testing is performed as part of a cross-functional Agile team. So break down as much as you can, break down the discussion of even using the terminology of what does test think versus what does development think. Stop that terminology. It's what does the team think? How does the team plan on attacking this feature? Start just talking about the team. All work is planned as a team, and you start blending the distinction of those functional boundaries. You emphasize real-time versus offline interaction. You want to get real-time interaction as much as you possibly can, even if it's instant messaging, real-time communication over sending an email or logging a bug report that someone may or may not look at for 3 days. Certainly that offline interaction is very wasteful from a real-time response perspective. You want to demand or set the tone that you want high degrees of collaboration. You want to encourage it. You want to emphasize it. So Scrum Masters, coaches want to constantly be reminding the team that get near face-to-face communication. When there's a problem, it's not just one team member's, role to solve that problem. It's a team problem. It's not an individual problem. The notion that testing is falling behind in the sprint, you want to poke at that. Testing is not falling behind in the sprint. The team is falling behind in getting their deliverables completed for the sprint that they've all committed to. That's a different view. Developers and testers, get them as closely co-located as you can. I see some cases where folks are just lazy. You have, on the second floor of a building that's adopting Agile, you have test groups, and on the third floor you have development groups, and they actually have the capacity of moving the groups together, but they just choose not to. And in that case, I would argue move them together, get the teams co-located, even if it means you take over a conference room and folks keep their desks, but you have a team room area where folks can collaborate for sprint planning, and they have collaborative periods of time each day. To me, that's a win-win of acknowledging how important that is. Some compensation for the distribution, team introductions and training. So at the very least, when you form an Agile team, introduce them to each other, schedule some training, maybe fly them in to meet each other just that one time if it's a distributed team. Start including virtual support infrastructure and visual interaction in your budgeting, and making sure that everyone has consistent tooling and it's not that expensive to produce the tooling for the team to be collaborating, and listen to the teams. Ask them how they would prefer to interact, and then support that. There's a lot of modern Agile tooling that sort of attempts to join teams in real time. Rally is an example of that, where you can actually have distributed planning poker for folks who are trying to do estimation distributed around the world. You can actually do backlog estimation as a distributed team. You can do sprint planning as a distributed team. It's not perfect. It's not face to face, but it does come closer to simulating that co-located team environment. From a work perspective, you want clarity of Done-ness Criteria that establishes joint activity towards getting story completion and sign-off. So you can, just by the very fact of how you craft your Done-ness Criteria and talking about reviews and sign-offs, we, for example, have the notion when a story is done that the product owner, that our tester demonstrates the functionality to the product owner, and the product owner then signs off on that behavior. And then in the daily stand-up, we acknowledge that and have a round of applause as we complete work in the sprint. The very fact of the Done-ness Criteria is how it's framed is driving some of that collaboration. And then user stories, an emphasis on collaboratively explored acceptance tests. So one of the things I really emphasize here is the acceptance test. A lot of teams forget, I think, the acceptance test part of user stories, but really emphasize that and extend it towards ATDD is acceptance test driven development, where you're including, now you have this triad of folks. So every user story really isn't developed in a vacuum or isn't developed with handoffs from developer to tester, but it's developed as sort of this active triad of developer plus tester plus product owner. And they're all nurturing it forward. They're all collaborating on that story. They all have a piece of it. Clearly the developers are coding, clearly the testers are testing, clearly the product owner is evaluating and providing feedback, real-time feedback, but they're working together on that. My, how time flies. So the fourth anti-pattern, and it's the final one for this session, is we have to supply the same metrics as we always have. This is sort of a pet peeve of mine, and I encounter it a lot in executive teams where very often in Agile instances, executive teams for, they're sponsoring Agile, and they're doing it from a position of not really knowing what it's all about. Usually the perception is either it's the latest methodology and everyone's, I'm an entrepreneurial company and we just need to be Agile. It'll help us achieve funding or it'll help us get faster. So there's these perceived benefits that the Agile methods have that are usually very trivialized and sort of superficial, but executives hang their hat on them and they inject Agile into their environment. But from a measurement perspective, from a reporting perspective, they don't really change things. So here they're fostering an Agile instance and an Agile adoption, but they're not adjusting their view, which they should. It's really immature to do this, but they're going to apply traditional metrics to their Agile teams, and they expect it to sort of come out in the wash. And I think that's a huge mistake. And it's not just the executives. I'm picking on stakeholders, but I'm really going to pick on everyone. So the development manager who's going to measure lines of code per day, the test manager who is micromanaging their team by test cases run per day per microsecond, or measuring their test team by bugs found, those traditional metrics, and then they'll flip those same measurements into Agile and they'll try to just sort of collect them from the Agile team. So often groups try to replicate that reporting exactly the same way. Defect trending, test case plan, coverage, test plan progress, quality plan progress, or rewarding, even worse. So it's even worse, is rewarding by metrics. And I mean like numerically rewarding, like incenting folks, rewarding them by number of bugs found, you get a bonus or something like that. How terrible could that be? So that's the anti-pattern. What's the recommendation? In a word, not do that, I guess, or in a few words, stay away from that. So metrics should be output. Agile metrics really change. They really change the game, and you need to be aware of this. Traditional metrics need to be de-emphasized in lieu of two types of, I think, Agile metrics. I'm not going to give you this list, so please don't walk away from this webinar saying Bob Galen says we need to measure, these two things, and then tie them to incentives, just like we did lines of code. That's not what I'm saying. But instead of having inbound, so for example, measuring the plan. That's not measure plan. That's not measure actuals versus estimates. That's look in two areas, key areas for Agile teams. We want to look at how they're producing work. What's coming out the outbound side of the queue? What are they delivering on a sprint by sprint and a release level? So things like look at team velocity, look at Done-ness Criteria adherence, look at story throughput. Look at quality escapes from sprint and release boundaries with root cause analysis. So I think those are sort of safe things. Don't incentivize them, but those are safe things to look at because then you can actually influence the team back to improve those things. So Agile is very much not a plan, measured on the inbound side, on the planning side. It's very much a how are we delivering value. The other area of metric that you really want to emphasize is value-based. So you want to try to work with your stakeholders, with your product owners, and look at value produced per sprint, even if it's a soft evaluation of value points per story, and have we focused on the right stories and delivering them in the right sequence from a team's perspective. So it's an emphasis on production and quality and then on value, but not production for its own sake. Please, you're really paying attention to how you're producing, but it's really quality and value. I should probably change this slide. The other thing in your metrics is if you want to move from a status reporting, just a state update point of view to so sending around status reports and reporting on your metrics. You want to change that view, and you want to more radiate where are we in a real-time and a transparent way. Alistair Coburn in the Crystal, one of the lesser-known Agile methods is something called Crystal, but he created this notion of an information radiator. If you're familiar with Scrum, then burn down and burn up charts are an instance of a information radiator. And what you want to do is you don't want to report on state. You want to just make it self-evident of where the team is. So you want these charts and these indicators and trending lines to be up on walls, if you will. I personally like posting all of this information on walls around our Scrum team. We're a pretty pretty low fidelity shop. And then stakeholders come by and they ask lots of questions about why is the trending up in this way or down in this way? Why does team, why does our third Scrum team have higher open defect counts in their sprint than the other three teams combined? To ask those questions. And the team has to defend that or answer that. We're transparent, and it drives wonderful discussion around where are we right now in the sprint? Are we succeeding or failing? Are we going to deliver on the sprint objectives or not? And what are we doing from a corrective action point of view? So examples of that are, burn down, burn up charts for defect trending. I think it's fair game to talk about manual test case execution. We're not trying to measure to predict how many per day. We're actually trying to look at maybe, the level of effort for manual tests as an indicator or a reference for doing more automation, and for the product owner to start paying attention to, my gosh, that team is really falling, they quote unquote are falling behind because they have so many manual tests. We need to make an investment in the backlog and automation, and have that aha moment and have the information radiators drive those aha moments from Agile, and don't be naive. That really is an important part of the Agile methodology. Is transparency drives a lot of team-based change, but also organizational-based change. That's really the end of my talk. I hit 4 anti-patterns. They were what I think of as test management, not necessarily manager-focused. I think they touched on 4 areas that I see a lot in my consulting and just in my travels as just an Agile enthusiast. I hope you found them valuable. I don't know if I see any questions on my board, so I'm wondering if there's any questions out there.
There's a couple of questions up there, Bob. We have 3 questions, actually. Okay. I can call them out to you there, Bob, and you can fire away with the answer. First question is from Kieran, and he says, testing is not falling behind in a sprint, the team is falling behind in a sprint. That's a quote, I think, from yourself. Should testing not be happening after the sprint is completed, or should it be factored in during the sprint?
So as part of sprint planning, and I hope I narrow and answer this, please re-ask the question if I don't, but during sprint planning, again, it's a team. The team has a responsibility to look at their Done-ness Criteria on a user story basis, and then to commit on a story-by-story basis to getting that work done for the end of the sprint. And what I mean by that is done. You hear the term done in Agile circles. That means that the team coalesced beyond their functional boundaries. Sure, developers are writing most of the code, testers are doing some testing, and product owners are product owning, and BAs are BAing and whatever. But the team has committed to a body of work that they all are going to deliver and to meet the Done-ness Criteria. So during the course of that sprint, I want to see development and testing activity, completing as soon as possible. And there should be no testing on that body of work after the sprint, if you will. Now, this is, again, for what the team committed to meet the team agreed Done-ness Criteria. In the harder context, what happens if the team cannot run, the team would like to run a full regression test, but a full regression test would take them 6 days and the entire team. So they would get very little feature work done. And they would run that let's say they ran two-week sprints, they would be running full regression tests every 2 weeks for 6 days. So it would be 60+% of their time was invested just in regression tests. Probably not the right answer. So I think some of the technical test debt cascades into the next sprint or the next sprint. That's what I meant by that test debt. But the commitment to done on a story level needs to be done. Otherwise, the team doesn't get credit for that story, and it bumps to the next sprint. So there is no partial credit. So you either have the story done and you get full credit and deliver, or you don't, from my point of view. What's the next question? Isn't Agile from different locations possible at all, or could it be done still using, I'm trying to see all of this, meaning all guys can virtually meet whenever needed? So using audio and video, can everyone just meet? I think you can do it. I just think it takes a lot of extra effort, and it takes a commitment by the team. I think it takes a commitment by leadership. The other thing is I think Agile teams, they need to meet. They need time to coalesce. They need time to form into a team. So very often, things like you want to support them with maybe some training. You don't want to just drop them into an Agile project and say, here, start sprinting. You might want to provide some training. You might want to occasionally get them together. When under normal circumstances, you would find excuses. Oh, we don't have the budget for that. Oh, it's too inconvenient. Oh, no one would support that. What I'm arguing is recognize that team cohesion is important, and distributed Agile teams are harder on the team than a co-located team. And do what we can with tooling, but also with funding and also with intention to get that team together as much as we can. The other aspect of it is even having small groups of a developer and a tester together. If you could have, so one option would be to have testers in Russia and developers in China and BAs in Argentina and your product owners in California, because California is a good place for product owners, and your Scrum Master is in Massachusetts. And there's a wonderful team, but it's all functionally distributed, so it's going to be very difficult for that team to implement the triad as I was describing it. But what if in China you took those developers or whoever I had put in China, and you actually staffed them with a BA, a tester, and a developer, and you gave them micro features, and you had a cluster of those in Russia and a cluster of those in China and a cluster of those in Argentina, so that those small groups could collaborate. Which is better? I would argue that the latter is better from a collaboration perspective. So how we orchestrate those distributed teams can have a big impact on their effectiveness. But sure, you can make things work. Another question is, do you believe that team morale is an important metric measurement? I've always found motivated and happy teams or productive teams. Have you encountered? You know what? This is a good catch. Whoever said that, thank you for catching that. I really think of three key metrics that I look at for Agile teams. One is quality, and I changed my slide to that on the fly. So I said we want quality metrics, and they're more escape-driven metrics. Then we also want value. We want to measure value, which is value to customer, and get as close to customer valuation as we can. And then the third metric, I think, for solid Agile teams is team morale. I'll give you an example because I just ran into a presentation by these folks at the Agile conference. But Salesforce.com, if you're familiar with them, they do quarterly surveys of their team. So one of they align with the metrics that I talked about: quality, value, and then team morale. And they do quarterly surveys, to measure team morale and how folks are adapting to their Agile journey. And Agile is not a static implementation of a methodology, so they're changing over time. And they've been doing Agile for, I think, since 2006. So there's a lot of adapting going on there, and they're constantly checking morale. So that was a good question. Yes, team morale does matter. But team morale, not test team morale, and not development team morale, and not BA team morale, but team morale. I think that's the end of my questions, Kevin, unless you see something else.
No, I don't see anything there. Just a comment here from Hayo, who says, thanks for the presentation. It was a clear and inspiring story. And Ziegler, I think, has a question here. He's asking for tips on how to keep the momentum in hardening and stabilization sprints. From his experience, it's hard to stick to Agile practices when there are no real development activities going on anymore.
So that sort of brings up some interesting thoughts on my perspective. So one quick reaction is, one of the things I like about stabilization sprints. So I don't like some teams when they're doing stabilization or hardening, the developers actually charge ahead. I've seen that, and I almost should list that as a sub-ante pattern from my point of view. Is you sort of split the team in hardening, and you let the developers run ahead into the next sprint or the next release's work, and the poor testers are left behind doing the hardening. So that's from my point of view an anti-pattern. So the developers and the testers developers are there. So how do I keep the momentum? Well, there's stuff to do. I hate to break the news, but developers can test, and we're going to find bugs, and they can fix bugs, and they can even write some test automation. So the hardening sprint, from my point of view, is it's a testing-focused or a quality-focused interval. We want to make it shorter over time, not longer. So it may not be the same length as your development sprints, so that could help. We keep it narrow and focused. It's a place for improvement activity if we have nothing else to do, if you will, meaning write some test automation. And it's all hands on deck in the team doing testing. So there's not much of a chance to get bored during that. Now, if we have the view that the developers can't pick up the keyboard and test, then yeah, there could be that problem. But I really subscribe to the view that if it's one team that's committing to these goals, then the developers can test. And I think that's actually a healthy paradigm. I get a lot of help. So I'm not just saying this as a consultant. That's what we do at iContact. My current role here is we're all hands on deck. And it really fosters that we all own the code and we own all aspects of the code. The other thing it really motivates us to focus on testability as a team. It focuses the developers. I hear this constantly of, gosh, I didn't realize it was how hard it was to test Blarg manually. My God, we need to do something about that. That's a terrible thing to do. So it provides sort of that motivation to get better. And so I think it's a healthy exercise if done well. I think I've touched on all the questions.
I think that's everything, Bob.
I want to thank everyone for attending and for spending the time. I really appreciate it. And I hope to see folks at EuroSTAR.
Excellent. Thanks for that, Bob, and thanks again for what was a great presentation. Some great feedback we've got here from some of the attendees. I'd just like to remind everyone that this is the middle of EuroSTAR webinar week. We have one left, and that's tomorrow afternoon. So if you want more details on it, you can go to the EuroSTAR website, take a look at the description, and maybe register. This webinar was also recorded, and over the coming weeks we'll be sending a mail to everyone that registered and attended, just letting you guys know that it's available in the archive and that you can go in and listen to any one of almost 30 webinars on demand at any time. This webinar is now over, so thanks again to Bob, and if you wouldn't mind hanging up and logging off, that would be fantastic. Thank you very much, everybody.